If you are on the social media platform called TikTok, you have likely seen the surge of videos about adult ADHD. Lots of adult ADHD videos and content have gone viral as content creators are raising awareness of a mental health condition that impacts millions of adults. Are these videos and content causing more harm than good? A TikTok adult ADHD influencer and experts weigh in. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
While over 6 million children in the United States receive a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, better known as ADHD, and those were numbers for 2019, but millions more adults are estimated to have it too, either having grown up with the diagnosis or being diagnosed later in life. What are the signs of ADHD in adults, and what are the factors leading to disparities in diagnosis and treatment? My first guest weighing in on this topic is Dani Donovan. She is an adult ADHD advocate and influencer on TikTok, a public speaker, and the creator of ADHDDD.com. She's also an adult living with ADHD. Good morning and welcome, Dani.
Morning. How's it going?
Pretty good. I first want to thank you for your advocacy and all the work that you are doing to raise awareness of ADHD. And also, congratulations on all the success you're having on social media and speaking at big conferences and really becoming the face of what adult ADHD looks like. Just help us understand, how you got into this world of content creation on TikTok, and particularly this topic of adult ADHD.
So it's a little. Oh, the tornado siren tests are going off for a second. Sorry about that. I definitely did not really plan on getting into this. I really stumbled into it by accident. I had just started a job as a graphic designer for Gallup, and I had been talking about to my coworkers about therapy, and I'd never done that with any of my friends. And so I started to be more open about having ADHD, and they were like, yeah, we figured. And so it ended up making this kind of inside joke about how I tell stories. And I turned it into a graphic, sent it to one of my best friends. And she was like, oh, that's totally you. I'm like, I know, I made it. And I wasn't going to post it because it said, ADHD and non-ADHD on it. And I hadn't really told people. And so she really told me to just go for it. So I posted it on Twitter where I thought no one would really see it. And that did not work out. So it went viral immediately. It was getting reposted by celebrities like Mindy Kaling. And it was this huge response of people who had ADHD and were crying from this kind of funny comic, but they felt so seen and validated. And then people who didn't have ADHD looked at it and said, wow, that really explains, why my loved one might kind of act like this. And so that first one went viral, and the response from people really prompted me to say, hey, I should make more of this. I haven't really seen anybody making this kind of content about ADHD. Maybe I've got some more things to say. And it turns out I've got a lot of things to talk about. So that kind of motivated me to get started and keep going.
So I know you eventually quit your job to become a full-time ADHD content creator. How scary was that for you?
It was scary, but I knew it was going to kind of happen eventually. It was difficult because I really liked my job. Working at Gallup was really rewarding for me because they focused a lot on people's strengths and what it is that makes you special. And so having ADHD, it was one where my skill set was so different than anyone on my team. And so I was really kind of incorporated into this team knowing kind of what I was good at. But it was because of Patreon, which is kind of like a crowdfunding website where people can donate $3 or $5 a month to their favorite creators and, have early access to my comics. And I had gotten to a point where my Patreon income was the same as my paychecks. And so at that point, I'd kind of been like stocking up, some money on the side. And I thought, I got to jump into this. I think I'm going to regret if it, takes me years and years to, make this happen. And so I left. My last day was February 28th, 2020. And like 2 weeks later, it was like, surprise, everybody's, staying home and everybody's kind of going through this big transition. So honestly, it sort of helped a little bit that I was so worried about working from home and being lonely. And now my husband was working from home, so I had some company, and the timing was bad, but it was secretly good.
Yeah. You definitely aren't alone in that regard. So you talk openly, Dani, on your website and through your videos about being an adult living with ADHD. When were you first diagnosed?
I was diagnosed when I was 19. I was a freshman in college. My parents had really provided me a lot of structure growing up. And so it didn't really become apparent until I was kind of responsible for everything. And I was like, it does not seem this hard for everybody else. But honestly, I just moved to a different town and I went to see someone because of depression. And she was kind of asking me questions. And she stopped and she goes, how much do you know about ADHD? And I'm like, I had this negative stereotype in my head at that time. And I'm like, I don't have it. And she kind of went through all the questions and gave me the test. She's like, you definitely do. And so, I started treatment and kind of started on, medication. And it was just like, wow, is this what it's kind of like for everybody else? And
Let me ask you this, Dani. Let me ask you, what were some of the symptoms that you had that, you said you thought you had depression, but like, what were you experiencing at the time?
A lot of my, I would say, visible symptoms were like physical disorganization, having a difficult time like doing laundry and then continuing to put it off because now I have 4 loads of laundry and I'm out of all my clothes, and 4 loads is like a lot. And so like, I'll just buy some new shirts instead of, washing shirts. And it started becoming apparent because I was staying up so late all of the time working on projects that I just put off until the day before, even though I kept thinking about starting it and thinking about starting it. And so there was this real inability to kind of execute on things that I wanted to do, not just stuff I didn't want to do.
And you said that, you had in your mind that, this, I guess I'll call it stigma about ADHD, that you couldn't, that wasn't the right diagnosis for you. What was your thinking about ADHD? What did you heard about it that made you think, oh, this is not something that I want to be, this isn't a label that I want?
Everyone I knew who had ADHD was a boy. Mm-hmm. And they were, I would say the stereotypical, like climbing on stuff and, running around and, I would say getting in trouble and being, I would say not having very many friends, unfortunately, like most of the people I knew. And I didn't want, I would say, that label because, again, I had the idea that hyperactivity looked like just extra amounts of energy, and not that in girls it can look like excessive chattiness or like, constant fidgeting and stuff like that. So once I did a little bit more research, it definitely made more sense, but I did have that misunderstanding of what it can look like in girls and women.
And you just said that you were able to get into some treatment. What does treatment look like for you?
So at the time I had just started meds and I wasn't seeing anyone except for medication management. And I didn't really talk to anyone about it for like a decade, right? Till I was 29. And I started, 28. And I actually decided to try art therapy. And so I went to that a few times and I just loved it. And I was breaking down kind of all the time, realizing this core of difficulty keeping friends and worrying that people thought I was annoying. But after my insurance changed and my art therapy wasn't covered. And so it was, I would say, a little discouraging to me at that point. But then I started to kind of make stuff on my own, which later turned into comics. So it worked out okay, I think.
Okay, I want to bring into the conversation, Dani, now Dr. Ed Hallowell. He is a board certified adult and child psychiatrist. He's the founder of the Hallowell ADHD Centers and a New York Times bestselling author of over 20 books, including Driven to Distraction, a series which sparked a revolution in the understanding of ADHD. He's also the author of the bestseller ADHD 2.0. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Hallowell.
So nice to be with you.
You literally wrote the book on ADHD. You know, I say that tongue in cheek, but you are the preeminent expert on ADHD. And when you listen to what Dani described, one, her believing that she had depression, is that common in adults who have ADHD, that they mistake it for something else like depression?
Absolutely. It's almost invariable. If you're an adult woman and you go for help, you'll be diagnosed with either depression or anxiety or both, and you'll be put on an SSRI. And that's mainly because only a few doctors even know what ADHD looks like in an adult woman. And so it's the doctor, it's not in his or her skill set to diagnose this condition. And it's such a shame because SSRIs do not treat the problem hardly at all and can make it worse. They can be cognitively dulling. They diminish libido. They can have activating side effects. So it's not the medication you need. And also, these women are denied the really good news that this condition, dealt with properly, becomes an asset in your life, far from being a liability. It can be a liability until you get diagnosed, but once you do get diagnosed, the sky's the limit. That's why I say I don't treat disabilities. I help people unwrap their gifts. ADHD dealt with properly can be a superpower. Dani's a successful illustrator, Dave Pilkey, who did the Captain Underpants series, sold 80 million copies. He's got both ADHD and dyslexia, like me. And he's just phenomenally creative. David Neilman, who founded JetBlue Airlines, has the condition, and he says it's the key to his success. Heather Reisman, the CEO of Indigo Books in Canada, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Canada, has it. And so lots of adults, particularly women, go undiagnosed. And it's a crying shame because as mega successful as those people I cited are, so the negative outcome can be, and these folks just can never get their act together. They can never get over procrastinating. They can never get over yes-butting themselves. And so they underachieve. They're frustrated. They're underachieved. And yes, they look like they're depressed, but they're really bummed out. It's not indwelling depression. It's frustration over I'm not able to get to where I want to get to. And I know I've got tremendous talent. I'm just not able to develop it. And that's where this diagnosis can really unwrap your gift, and you can go from frustrated, underachieving, feeling, marginalized and not where you ought to be in life to just the opposite, running your own business, having a wonderful relationship, being a wonderful friend. And we tend to be, I say we because I have it myself, we tend to be, when we're, unwrapped as our gift, we are the game changers. We are the entrepreneurs. We're the creators, the discoverers, the inventors. We're the people like Dani who just come out of nowhere and fill the world with joy and information and laughter. We're a tremendous asset waiting to be tapped.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Hallowell, for giving us that encouraging note. I want to step back, though, because help us understand what ADHD is. I think a lot of people probably have a misconception about what it is. And as much as we love our social media, we don't want people making their or trying to diagnose themselves by watching a video on social media. So you're the preeminent, authority on it. So tell us what ADHD is.
Now, what the social media can do is raise your index of suspicion, and then you go see a professional. But choose that professional carefully, because a lot of professionals just don't get it when it comes to adults with ADHD, particularly females who are the more daydreamy, creative type. What it is, it's a brain difference that you're born with. It's genetically transmitted, and it's something you're born with. The positives are creativity, originality, curiosity, drive, grit, a tremendous capacity to envision, create, develop. Though we are the entrepreneurs, we're the artists, we're the developers. The downside is we have trouble paying attention when we're not interested. It's not a deficit of attention, it's a wandering of attention. Boredom is our kryptonite. The minute we encounter boredom, we bounce off of it. We just can't do boredom. So we're hopping from interesting thing to interesting thing. Not a deficit, but a definite wandering, and that can lead to underachievement if you can't stay with a topic long enough to develop it and turn it into what you want. And then the other big problem is so-called executive functioning, organizing, planning. In our world, we have a different sense of time. In our world, there are basically two times. There's now and there's not now. So you say, well, the paper is due next Thursday. Not now, and it's gone until not now is almost now. And then in a panic, we get it done at the very last minute. So we're living from a crisis to crisis, deadline to deadline. And what happens in a panic is you put out a lot of adrenaline. Well, adrenaline is chemically very similar to the medications we use to treat ADHD. So you're essentially self-medicating with panic, with adrenaline, and living by chronic procrastination. And then we can go down blind alleys. We can go down rabbit holes. We tend to have trouble picking the right mate. We often fall for train wrecks because we love the stimulation, and we're also born saviors. We think we can save them. That's usually doesn't work out too well. But what makes the condition so interesting is that it can go one extreme way or the other. The prison population is way overrepresented, people with ADHD. The addicted population, way overrepresented. The unemployed, the marginalized, way overrepresented. But so are the Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer Prize winners and self-made millionaires and billionaires. Interestingly enough, the guy who invented the PCR reaction, the test we've been using during COVID, the polymerase chain reaction, had big time ADD, and he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for inventing the polymerase chain reaction. So, wherever you look, you'll find high achieving creative folks. But the reason that people like Dani and I get so impassioned is we're missing so many, hundreds of thousands, particularly adults, women and men, and women more than men, because women tend to present in the daydreamy way. They're not the hyperactive, disruptive kind. They're the daydreamy, underachieving, can't get their act together, quote unquote. And they're one diagnosis and treatment plan away from absolutely flourishing.
And Dani, since you've been creating, this content using your graphic design background, doing these illustrations, doing these videos, what has the response been? Have you had women in particular, DMing you or, contacting you on your social sites, telling you that, the world has opened up for them because you now are speaking publicly about ADHD?
Yes, so the response has been just incredible. People even, talking in the comments, talking to one another, and forming, a real community. But I get, I'd say probably 10 to 15 like emails and DMs a day from people who are telling me, thank you so much for this content. Like, I feel so seen, or I'm learning more about myself. And I used to think I was lazy and that all of these were just personality defects. And I didn't, think to tie them together. And so particularly with women, I hear a lot of people talking to me specifically about the kind of care tasks that I think a lot of women just in society have been maybe expected to be better at, right? Cleaning your house, buying groceries, cooking yourself meals, doing laundry, those kinds of routine tasks that a lot of times do fall on women. So there's this real shame in feeling like you can't keep up with that ever. These routine tasks, like Dr. Hallowell had said, are not fun. They're boring, they never end. And so we kind of continue to put them off until there's a disaster area. Myself, this room, completely trashed this morning, completely trashed. And I set, a timer for an hour, and I thought to myself, I'm going to see how much I can get done in an hour. And things like that are kind of techniques that myself and others talk about, where you are kind of putting it down to the wire, you are gamifying it, you're making it a challenge. And so being able to express these types of strategies to help people with ADHD understand how symptoms can show up in their life in areas that aren't just school and work, and then giving them hopefully some tools and strategies to learn how to, trick our brains or kind of figure out how to make things a little bit more fun.
Yeah. And Dr. Hallowell, I want to ask you about medication because you mentioned SSRI and other medications we know are prescribed for ADHD. But before I do that, for anyone sitting at home, trying to figure out what boxes should they be checking or asking themselves what questions, or trying to figure out, do they fit into a classic ADHD diagnosis? What are some of the things that women in particular should be, looking for as potential symptoms that should lead them to get a professional diagnosis?
Sure. Let me just correct one thing. SSRIs are not for ADHD. That they're the ones that get prescribed that shouldn't be. The meds that should be are called stimulant medications. But the lead symptoms in adults are, number one, at the top of the list, unexplained underachievement. You just have this notion, this conviction, I know I could be doing better, and I can't figure out why. Why am I a day late and a dollar short? Why am I procrastinating? Why do I have all these people telling me, oh, you're so talented? Why haven't you done more with it? I mean, that's the refrain. You could be doing better. And it's because nobody told you that you have trouble focusing when you're not interested. You were just told to try harder. Well, telling someone with ADD to try harder is about as helpful as telling someone who's nearsighted to squint harder. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of adults out there going around squinting and bumping into things and underachieving when all they needed was eyeglasses. And in this case, the diagnosis of ADHD and maybe a trial of medication or working with a coach, the various interventions that we've got. But until you have the diagnosis. But
okay, so we're talking about the symptoms. So you said underachieving is one.
Underachievement, problems with time management, the tendency to procrastinate, trouble with so-called executive function. So organizing, planning, like Dani said, her room was a disaster zone. So you have rooms that are just piles everywhere, clutter everywhere, and you're always saying, oh, I'll get to that, tomorrow. And so the problems with completing tasks, you love the beginning, you have trouble finishing, tendency to be impatient and impulsive. If we're interrupted, we can snap, that kind of thing. And a tendency to overlook little details, forget little details because they're not interesting. Anything that's boring, we avoid. Anything that's but high stim, we're right there. We're the creator, we're the builder. So you have these opposite paradoxical symptoms: tendency to space out, ability to hyperfocus. But if you're underachieving, if you have trouble with organizing and planning, if you tend to be on the impulsive side, if you're impatient, if you're really curious but have trouble organizing and turning that into something, that's ADD. And it's really good news because we can really help you.
Yeah. And let's talk about some of the help, Dr. Hallowell, because we hear a lot, and there are lots of articles that say, we're over-medicating people with ADD and ADHD. What do you say is the gold standard of treatment?
Well, it begins with education, and that's why shows like this are so very, very important. It's not just a matter of going and getting a prescription at all. That's woefully inadequate. So it begins with education, and it turns out this condition is very complicated. It's not just hyperactive little boys at all. It's nuanced, and it needs to be understood as a potential asset, but also can really bring you down in life and hold you back. So it begins with education. And my last book, ADHD 2.0, has the advantage of being very short. It's only about 120 pages, and it's got everything you need. And so then you begin by understanding it, and then it's this whole new lease on life. These people are set free. Oh my God, someone finally understands me. I'm seen, I'm appreciated. I can see myself, and I'm not the undisciplined loser that I've been told I was for so many years. So that's the starting point. And then in that context, you ask big questions. Are you in the right job? Are you in the right relationship? And then you ask smaller questions. Are you getting exercise? Are you eating right? Are you getting sleep? Maybe you take up medication. One of the things that's not stressed nearly enough, in my opinion, is we need a creative outlet. We must have a creative outlet. I've written 21 books. The reason I write so many books, it's not like I'm ambitious to write books. If I don't have a book going, I get depressed. And that's what we're like. If we don't have a creative outlet, we just don't feel fulfilled. We don't feel on top of our game. So we need a creative outlet. It's absolutely essential. And I think not enough of us stress that. And, and for Dani, I'm sure she would agree with that. And then in that context of all these other interventions, you can consider medication. Medication, in my book, I call it the most powerful tool everyone fears. People are really afraid of medication. People ask me, do I believe in medication? And my answer is, it's not a religious principle. It's a medication. If it helps you and doesn't cause side effects, great, take it. If it doesn't help you or does cause side effects, then don't take it. That's it in a nutshell. And yet it's turned into this big controversy, people pro and con, and it's a shame, because this tool properly used is an absolute godsend. It'll help about 80% of the time. 20%, it either doesn't work or causes side effects. So 80% is a pretty good batting average, but it's not 100%, nor is it necessary if you just don't want to take medication for whatever reason. That's fine. We can work with you. In the book, I tell the story of a little boy in China I treated long distance just using specialized forms of exercise. So, but don't fear the diagnosis, because it's good news, your marker of talent. And don't fear medication, because in the hands of a doctor who knows what he or she is doing, it's very safe. And when it works, it's like eyeglasses. It's a total game changer.
And Dani, just final question for you. What do you want the takeaway to be from all this work you're doing, these creative videos, these illustrations, this website now that you've created, the millions of people that you're communicating with through social media? What's the big takeaway?
So for me, it has really been about not just helping, get rid of the stigma, because that's such a complex and abstract concept. And the best way to do that is to get people talking about it, to help people not be afraid to talk about their own ADHD, to have ADHD content, getting in front of the eyes of both people who might have a diagnosis and didn't, connect all the dots of how not everything, but a lot of things in their life, particularly things they feel ashamed about, that those can be tied to it, but also getting in front of people who might not know they have ADHD. And that, again, it's not a matter of, oh, I saw a TikTok or two and now I think I have it. But if people can then go to that creator's page and go through a bunch of their comics or go through a bunch of their TikToks, and every single one sounds like them, it's just really cathartic to, even if you're not going to express it yourself, to see someone else verbalizing it. But again, to help people maybe get the diagnosis that they need. And so a main takeaway is that there's such a community now, that people who are now realizing things about their ADHD are getting, looking up more, researching more, finding Dr. Hallowell's books, listening to podcasts, people who might otherwise wouldn't have looked those things up on their own. So I really think that there is, that kind of education, finding some humor in it. But at the end of the day, hearing people now who have been like, I was afraid to tell my employer, I was afraid to talk about this online. There are so many ADHD creators out there now where there weren't before. In just a couple years, this whole community full of creators, full of people expressing themselves and getting it out. It's just a really beautiful thing.
No, thank you so much for that, Dani. Dr. Hallowell, I'm running out of time, but just real quickly, how many adults could you estimate are living with ADHD or ADD and are undiagnosed? Do you know that number?
Oh, millions. You see, the people who get diagnosed are the ones who have severe symptoms that are really limiting them and impairing them. Those are the adults who get diagnosed. There are millions of adults who could be doing so much better, do get more done with less effort if they got the diagnosis and the treatment, but they don't go for help because they're doing fine. They don't know, that if they only had eyeglasses, they could, be a knife through butter. Another analogy I use, they're driving on square wheels. And if they got the diagnosis, they could get round wheels. Imagine how much further you go with less effort on round wheels as opposed to square wheels. Unfortunately, a lot of people just were like Danny used to be. What do you mean? I don't have that. That's just stupid people, or that's just hyperactive boys, or that's a kid's thing, or the just gross misconceptions of what it is, that it's a marker of talent, common among people who have the potential to achieve at a very high level. And look, Dani, once she discovered her creative outlet, she took off. And that's representative. That's what happens. What makes me sad is that a lot of people are struggling. They haven't found the answer, and they may not be languishing, but they're not thriving nearly as fully as they could be in life. And that's why people like me and Danny really want to get the word out. It's good news. It's not to be feared, and people fear it, and they stereotype it, and so they don't take advantage of the tremendous impact diagnosis and treatment can have.
Well, your book, Dr. Hallowell, ADHD 2.0, I love it. You said 120 pages, so that means it's a quick read, but informative. Thank you, Dani, for all the work that you're doing. You can follow Dani on TikTok, Twitter, and all her social channels. She makes you laugh, but she makes you smile, but she also informs and educates. And I just love you for the work you're doing. Thank you so much, Dr. Hallowell. I can't wait till you write those other 20 books to add to the 21 you've already written. So,
I should live so long, right?
Thanks both of you for sitting down with me this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, ADHD does not discriminate by gender or race, but white boys are still more likely to be diagnosed and treated for the condition than anyone else. Experts say this leads to an inequity in care that hurts girls of any background and particularly children of color. My next two guests are experts in ADHD and disparities in diagnosis and treatment. Joining me is Dr. Earl Turner. He is a psychologist and founder of Therapy for Black Kids, and Dr. Paul Morgan. He is the director of the Center for Educational Disparities Research at Penn State University. He's also the author of several lead studies which show disparities in diagnosis and treatment of ADHD. Good morning, Dr. Turner and Dr. Moore.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, returning to the show, Dr. Turner. You've been on before. We've talked a lot about trauma, particularly in the Black community. We've talked about anxiety and depression. And today we're talking about ADHD. And I know that you see a lot of kids in your practice. And we were talking with Dr. Hallowell and Dani about adults with ADHD, but lots of kids are diagnosed with ADHD starting in kindergarten. And we know that Black children are 70% less likely to receive a diagnosis than white kids. What's driving the disparities that we see in diagnosis with ADHD, particularly, with young kids?
Yeah, I think some of the things that were discussed earlier by Dr. Hallowell definitely resonate and are important when it comes to some of the symptoms, particularly when we think about sort of young children in the school environment. Oftentimes, particularly for students of color, teachers will sort of identify some of these behavioral challenges and difficulties that they may be experiencing, and they're not seen as being contributed to symptoms of ADHD. And so that's a huge factor that oftentimes contribute to, I would say, misdiagnosis and then inaccurate diagnosis when it comes to them not receiving an ADHD diagnosis.
And I know, Dr. Morgan, you've done a lot of work, a lot of studies. You've been the lead author on a lot of studies looking at these disparities. And I was looking at a couple of articles that you were quoted in. Then I found some other articles that said that it's a misstatement of facts to say that Black kids are less likely to be diagnosed. So, where is the science on this? Because I was getting confused about what I was reading, because I was finding conflicting information.
Sure. Good question. So it's helpful to think of that as two different ways of examining the data. And sometimes one is inferred to be the other inaccurately. So you can talk about representation, relative percentage, and then you can talk about identification or likelihood. With the representation, you can find some, depending on the data source, some indication that in terms of a raw percentage that children of color sometimes have higher rates of ADHD diagnosis, as well as for some other conditions. But when you look at children who are otherwise similar to help approximate contrasts that are helpful in understanding potential for bias or discrimination, a clear finding from that research is that among children who display similar clinical needs for ADHD or other conditions, that children of color are much less likely to be diagnosed and receive treatment. And there are many reasons for that: historical and ongoing societal inequities that elevate children of color's exposure to poverty, and the correlates of poverty, say lead exposure or low birth weight, for example, that themselves elevate children's likelihood of being diagnosed as having disabilities. So when you look at children who are otherwise similar in terms of their clinical needs, you find a consistent finding that white children are more likely to be diagnosed than Black, Hispanic, Asian, children of other race, ethnicity, Native Americans, across a wide age span developmentally, as well as across ADHD and other similar disability conditions.
And we know, Dr. Turner, that boys are typically, when they exhibit some of these symptoms, particularly in early, grades in school, they're considered troublemakers. We know that children of color are more likely to be suspended from school because of their conduct. Many of them will get an eligibility determination as emotionally disturbed. We know many of them will be moved out of, general education and put into special education classrooms. But girls seem to be treated differently. Girls don't seem to receive the same treatment. When girls act up, I'll use the term act up, however, use that loosely, but girls are not likely to be treated in the same way as boys. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I think part of the issue sort of, again, goes back to some of the earlier discussion on the show, is that symptom presentation tends to differ among boys and girls. And so we'll see girls that may be more inattentive, disorganized, as opposed to the hyperactive type that we see with boys. And so because these behaviors that boys may exhibit may be more problematic or may be more sort of easily observed by adults, then they're more likely to be sent in for referrals to get an evaluation and then receive the diagnosis, where girls, they may be having difficulties sort of functioning with, in terms of like their organization and executive functioning and planning skills, that's just sort of presumed as like maybe they're not interested in the school, or they may be labeled more with educational diagnosis or learning disabilities, as opposed to receiving that ADHD diagnosis, which may be more accurate.
And Dr. Morgan, I saw something really interesting. So I'm an autism advocate. I'm a parent of a child with autism. I run an organization that focuses on autism and other developmental disabilities. And one of the things that we started to see in the work that we do is Black families being very suspect and suspicious and hesitant to get a diagnosis of whether it was autism or ADHD or any of the developmental disabilities or mental health disabilities. But white families in Los Angeles, where I live and do most of my work, were readily seeking diagnoses for eligibility purposes, and it started to be this kind of running joke in the autism and the disability community that white kids that may be able to get into UCLA, their parents wanted them to go to Stanford or Harvard, and if they got an ADHD diagnosis, they could get on medication, and that would maybe, as Dr. Hallowell said, unleash their potential, and they would end up in Ivies versus UCLA. So help us understand this is a whole thing around race and labels and families' approach to these very serious conditions.
That's an excellent question. I would say several things. One, and when we think about race and economic disadvantage being correlated, one thing that may be happening is that white families are better informed or knowledgeable about the signs, symptoms, and potential treatments for autism or other disability conditions. And they may recognize that the diagnosis can lead to supports that otherwise would be unavailable to them. There is
Extra time for taking tests. Let's talk about what
extra time for taking tests, proximity in the classroom, more time to complete assignments. So these are standard accommodations that children with, say, ADHD or other disability conditions can receive through the school system, as well as in post-secondary environments. So white families may be more informed, happen to be more knowledgeable about those potential supports and may seek them out as a result.
But not only just informed, what we were seeing is that white families did not see stigma. So they
right.
saw status even. I'll go as far as to say in some ways it was status.
Right.
Because their kids were getting extra time on tests, extra time with homework assignments, the proximity that you talked about, that they wore it as a badge of honor. Help us understand the psychology
yes,
of that.
Right. Well, I think there's a great deal of truth in that, and that an acceptance about the neurological underpinnings of the diagnosis might be more prevalent in white families than, say, Black or Hispanic families who may not be as knowledgeable, or may, and for very understandable reasons, be more inclined to attribute some recommendation or referral by a teacher or a psychologist as potentially racially biased or culturally insensitive. And those are, of course, very important to address and make sure that that's not what's driving the referral. When families of color are provided with evidence-based information about autism or other conditions, they tend to find that very valuable and helpful. Efforts to create more culturally sensitive diagnostic assessments are very valued too by families of color. And there's also, I would say, a great deal of unmet need in historically marginalized communities. And there are many families of color who are trying to get services for their child and face at times dismissive providers who are disinclined to provide a diagnosis and attending treatment for their children.
And Dr. Turner, you see a lot of Black kids in your practice. Are you seeing any shifts in kind of those attitudes that maybe were very prevalent 10, 15 years ago, where Black families were adamantly opposed to their kids being diagnosed? There's this thing that, all Black boys were on Ritalin. They were all diagnosed with ADHD. They were all prescribed medication. And it became a negative in the community. It was a stigma associated with getting the diagnosis and definitely getting prescription medication. Are you seeing any changes in that, where Black families are becoming more accepting of, a diagnosis and then the kind of medication that is often prescribed for kids with ADHD?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go briefly back to the other point that you were talking about with the labeling, because I think that's an important issue. Going back to what Dr. Morgan mentioned, because I think for Black families, that sometimes when their child does receive that label, that they do tend to be treated more unfairly compared to their white counterparts, and they may not get the resources, and there may be pressure to place them in special education systems. So I think the reality is that there's a real concern that needs to be addressed that may also reduce some of their stigma around the services. But I do think that we are beginning to see a shift in terms of openness around receiving treatment and getting diagnoses that are appropriate. And I think that part of it is going back to this sort of increased awareness and conversations around mental health. And so for me, with starting therapy for Black kids, really trying to push out that educational piece around different types of diagnostic conditions for parents, and really giving them that awareness so that they know what are the signs and symptoms of some of these conditions that their child could potentially experience, and that we are able to connect them early to get the resources and the tools that they need to be able to help their children thrive, and to be able to prevent some of the challenges that were discussed early in terms of difficulties in adulthood, because we know that for many kids, particularly those of color, if they don't get in for services, there's about a 10-year gap for that. And that obviously leads to more challenges and difficulties for them later on in life. So I do think that we're beginning to see more people, Black families and people of color, be open about mental health and diagnosis. And I think part of that is really driven by this social media influence and sort of this getting inundated with information and having creators that are sharing different types of things about their own personal experience or about their kids when it comes to different types of conditions.
Do you see changes happening, Dr. Morgan, at the school level? Because Dr. Turner said parents are becoming more receptive, parents of color. But what about educators? Or are they? Do you see a shift? A shift away from the blaming the kid, blaming the environment, blaming the parent that we often see, particularly with kids of color who aren't diagnosed,
Yep.
but yet there are these environmental factors that are pointed to by the educators as to why the child may not be performing, at grade level. Are educators starting to understand and move away from some of those racist and stereotypical tropes?
That's an excellent question. I would say that there is a greater sensitivity writ large by teachers about the potential for racial bias. One possibility is that although that's benefited many kids, it may have led to something of a correction where some kids are not being appropriately diagnosed who may have a disability. I would certainly agree with Dr. Turner's observation that untreated ADHD predisposes children to many events or occurrences that we'd rather have them avoid. The prognosis from a life course perspective is not optimal for those children. And so receiving a diagnosis and attending treatment, I think, is preferred for those children who indeed do have ADHD. To go back to some of the earlier discussion with the prior guests, I just would like to emphasize that the way I think the general public should think about ADHD diagnostically is this is something that occurs across two different dimensions: inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. There are multiple signs or symptoms. Those should occur over a sustained period, say 6 months, across two different settings, say family and school, and really should be impairing a major life activity, say schooling or work or social relationships. So there might be some children on the more mild end of the impairment spectrum who are being diagnosed who may not need medication or additional supports, but I think there are many children who have more moderate or severe types of ADHD who are not being appropriately diagnosed, particularly among children of color, as well as children who are non-English, coming from non-English speaking backgrounds. And just the last thing, if I may, in terms of the schools, the way services are provided are sort of two different mechanisms under ADHD. One is through special education, which would involve a multidisciplinary team over a sustained amount of time in terms of deciding whether the child has a disability sufficiently significant to warrant additional services through the school. Another is through what's called a 504 plan. And this is something that once the child is diagnosed, say through a pediatrician or a psychiatrist or psychologist, the family then can go to the school, inform the school about the diagnosis, and then receive services that tend to be less intensive, for example, and you want the services to be aligned to the level of the impairment that the child is experiencing. But parents are kind of in the driver's seat across both systems. The 504 tends to be initiated possibly by a teacher suspecting the child might have ADHD, but the parent is largely responsible for then organizing and arranging for services and agreeing to those services. And under special education, parents have substantial rights in terms of how children are diagnosed and the services they receive, as well as where those services are provided.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. And those special education services are arranged and provided under federal law. Individuals under what we call the IEP process, where this multidisciplinary team comes together. There's an evaluation made and recommendations about services. It could be a special classroom. It could be, a therapist that provides some additional services to a child during the school process. And the federal law mandates that the schools seek and find kids that have disabilities.
That's right.
Parents can also, if they suspect their kids have a disability, they can ask for an evaluation provided free of charge at public schools, no matter where you are throughout the country. You can request an evaluation and then have this process take place and receive services if your child is eligible. I do want to ask you, Dr. Turner, though, about adults, particularly Black women. This conversation was really sparked by an article that Dr. Morgan is quoted in, where Black women were speaking out about how difficult it has been for them to find community and also to get diagnosed. Are you finding that there is, some disparities? We talked about what happens in the school setting. We know what those disparities look like. But what about when adults try to seek a diagnosis? Are you finding disparities in getting diagnosis for African American women in particular?
Yeah, well, I think, what we know from looking at the research on this is that there tends to be some misdiagnosis when it comes to that. And so I think one of the things that was sort of highlighted earlier in terms of like, what are the symptom presentations? And so I think that for a lot of people of color and Black women, that if they are not exhibiting these sort of typical traditional types of symptoms that we may, or classic ADHD symptoms, and then maybe exhibiting more sort of mood frustration or frustration tolerance and those types of things, is that they may tend to get more of a mood diagnosis label or something related to like bipolar disorder, for example, as opposed to giving a diagnosis of ADHD. And so I think that is a real challenge that we need to be better as a field in terms of how we engage in our assessment and diagnosis, and making sure that we're culturally sensitive in the types of questions that we ask. And I think that, although the measures that we oftentimes use in terms of ADHD diagnosis are a gold standard, we know that some of the way the items are worded may not mean the same thing to certain communities. And so I think we continually need to sort of examine that and be critical about the way that people respond to those items, and to do a check-in to make sure that that's really reflective of that person's experience.
Well, Dr. Morgan, we heard Dani, our guest that was on earlier, talk about getting a depression diagnosis and being prescribed, I guess, these SSRI. And you can tell us what that medication is. Dr. Hallowell said that is not the right medication for ADHD. But if you are, like every typical person is, you go to a doctor and they say you have depression or you have mood disorder or bipolar, how do you know that that diagnosis isn't the right diagnosis? And if they prescribe some of this SSRI type medication, how do you know you shouldn't be taking that?
Well, that's a good question. I think you want to be open-minded about your clinician's assessment, given their training. It is true that there is a degree of comorbidity with ADHD as well as other mental health conditions, including anxiety and depression or learning disabilities. Some of those other conditions might be diagnosed when, in fact, the ADHD is largely driving those the symptoms of those other conditions, especially as we're talking about adults, especially for adults who have not been diagnosed and their problems have compounded over time. From my experience, what started as maybe a degree of impulsivity or inattention has compounded and created other sorts of problems, academic difficulties in school, behavioral problems, difficulties with social emotional adjustment. So it's important to listen to your provider. It's important to be also knowledgeable and go to the other sources that are available to you, including the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Mental Health, have a great deal of information. There are many advocacy organizations which provide information that's evidence-based that you can examine as an individual or if it's for a child, as a family member, to make sure you're getting high quality care from your provider. That's certainly important. And if I may just say one other thing in terms of schools, there is some evidence that schools are more likely to criminalize problem behaviors in children of color than they are to medicalize those behaviors. So there is some evidence, including by a colleague here at Penn State, that children of color, particularly Black children who are displaying some degree of problem behavior, are more likely to be suspended or experience expulsion, whereas children who are white who are displaying the same behaviors are more likely to receive an IEP or a 504 plan because their behaviors are medicalized instead of criminalized. And then when we look at those children as they move through the life course, children whose behaviors are criminalized are more likely to encounter the juvenile justice system, and those who are medicalized are more likely not to be involved with the juvenile justice system, but instead be receiving mental health services.
No,
So
that's an excellent point. And there's some data out there that Black girls in particular, I think, suspended 6 times more often than white girls. And we know the stats are off the chart for Black boys in terms of suspensions and, how they get moved from, the school to the prison pipeline. So, and a lot of that starts with some of the behaviors that we're talking about. Dr. Morgan, help us again with this medication, the SSRI. What is that medication? What is it typically prescribed for?
It's an uptake inhibitor affecting serotonin. What you're looking for from your provider is a medication for ADHD. Most of that medication is stimulant based. Some other variations are non-stimulant based. And what you want your provider to do, just to back up for a second, there's no blood test for ADHD. It relies on a lot of symptom presentation and case history. Once the diagnosis is made, there are multiple treatment options. So family therapy, group-based therapy, medication. In terms of medication, the provider doesn't have any biological-based data that he or she is making the medication decisions on. Instead, what tends to happen is the provider goes with the typical type of medication that might be provided, stimulants, say Ritalin. Then the child receives that medication at a starting dosage, and the provider will regularly meet with the family to see how that's working. And if symptoms are decreasing in terms of ADHD, as well as whether there's any side effects, say loss of appetite or difficulty sleeping. The dosage then may be changed, or the particular type of medication may change, say another variation of a stimulant medication or a move from a stimulant to a non-stimulant. And there's a little bit of guesswork that's happening to find what seems to work for that particular child. And it's based on symptom presentation. So how is your child doing in school? How are the symptoms of inattention? Is the child listening better organized, less fidgety? And are there any side effects? So is the child losing sleep, or is there a significant degree of loss of appetite, or things of this nature? And as the child ages, then his or her own, information is sort of given some credence to by the provider as well. So if you're diagnosed with ADHD, if you have ADHD, I would recommend being evaluated. And if you receive the diagnosis, then receiving treatment. If you're receiving medication, you should plan that there will be a trial and error process that will take place between you and the provider, or between your child and the provider, to find what seems to be the right dose. And that's just typical of the process.
And last question for you, Dr. Turner. If you have not been diagnosed with ADHD as a child, are there any, statistics or data out there about the likelihood of you developing ADHD as an adult? Is it something that you can have the first onset as an adult, or is the population of adults with ADHD, kids who had it but who were undiagnosed?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I was sitting here, I was like, I think I probably have been undiagnosed myself. But I think what we know in terms of the condition is that it's a condition that starts early in childhood. So you don't just develop ADHD as an adult. When you're getting diagnosed as an adult, oftentimes the criteria is that we're looking back during childhood to see if you exhibited these concerns or difficulties during that particular time period. And so for someone who is struggling with difficulties as an adult with, planning an organization, with, concentration, those types of things, it's probably, 90 to 100% likely that you experience these difficulties as a child, that they were sort of unrecognized, or they were not as severe as sort of was highlighted earlier. And so you didn't experience as many difficulties across multiple settings, and so you were able to function, compared to some of those that may have struggled more significantly in terms of the challenges with ADHD.
Okay, good to know, because I don't want people to leave, the show thinking, oh my God, everybody has to go out and get diagnosed, and that it is something that just occurs as an adult. But thank you so much, Dr. Morgan and Dr. Turner, for your insights and for the great information that you provided today. Really helpful in helping us sort this out. A very important issue. Millions of people who suffer from ADHD, and as Dr. Hallowell said, I shouldn't even use the word suffer, people who could otherwise be thriving if they got the proper diagnosis and the proper treatment, which is a spectrum of treatment from medication to, as Dani told us, she even tried art therapy. Again, thank you for your time. All right.
My pleasure.
I want to thank all of my guests this morning, and thanks for you for joining me. This all started because of an interesting article about Black women and how they were having a difficult time finding community and getting a proper diagnosis. I want to thank Dani in particular for the great work she's doing in terms of creating communities. There are lots of African American TikTok influencers and other social media influencers who are also creating great content. So if you're out there, you're feeling lonely, you're feeling alone, know that there are people out there who are creating online communities that you can join, where you can get information, you can get inspiration, and you can feel like you are a part of a much larger group. And then as Dr. Holloway and Morgan and Turner so appropriately stated, there are professionals all over this country who can provide you with a proper and appropriate and accurate diagnosis and can make recommendations to you for treatment. So don't shy away from getting a diagnosis. Don't worry about labels. You wouldn't shy away from getting diagnosed with diabetes if you had symptoms of diabetes. So mental health conditions, we've got to remove the stigma. I just wrote an article in Woman 2.0 about Britney Spears and about how we have to start thinking and talking about mental health differently in this country, so that people who are experiencing issues of anxiety, depression, inability to function, don't have to suffer in silence, don't have to suffer alone, but that they can seek out others and they can seek out help. So if nothing else today, I hope we did our part in trying to destigmatize mental health and mental health conditions and help people get connected to resources and services. Just some words to live by before I get out. No one should have to suffer in silence or in isolation. I was recently moved by the words of Renee Brooks. She's a 25-year-old Black woman who was diagnosed with ADHD as a child. Her mother rejected the diagnosis because she feared that her daughter, Renee, would be labeled and that she would be given medication. And essentially, she thought her daughter would be drugged by the healthcare community. Renee was diagnosed twice, once as a child, then again as a young adult, and then a third time at 25. At that point, she was on the brink of losing her job. Her life was falling apart. She couldn't keep up with the workload at her job, and she just knew something wasn't right. Monique decided at the age of 25 to get treatment, to accept the diagnosis and to actually get treatment. She started a medication, and she said her brain felt like it had been switched on, and instantly she was able to be more productive. Renee said that when she started receiving treatment, the biggest impact was to her self-esteem. She said she was no longer concerned that she was just lazy or unmotivated, which is what she had been told throughout her life. She instantly knew that she had a problem and that problems have solutions. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.
Thank you.